however you want. It sort of alerts me to the fact that. Oh, you sit where you want. Don't worry about it.
Sorry, you have our pile of coats and bags.
All right, folks, we're back. Welcome back on Zoom and in person here from Concordia University's fourth space. We're joined by the three last guests of today, Patrick Leroux's last guest. Patrick, of course, being the Associate Dean of Research in the Faculty of Fine Arts, hosting a whole series of conversations. Research in Conversation is the title of this series in the Faculty of Fine Arts, happening all week this week at fourth space. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Patrick. Welcome back.
Thank you, Anna. Welcome, everyone, and welcome to those of you joining us online or in the recorded sessions that you'll be able to consult online or in podcast format eventually. So as Anna mentioned, this is the third of 12 research and conversation talks. This morning we spoke to V.K. Preston and Ray Mansbach, a professor of history, assistant professor of history, and Ray, an assistant professor of physics. Now we move on to the realm of the social sciences writ large. It's really a pleasure to be sitting with you. We were just talking before starting about the fact that we've emailed, we've Zoomed. We've had so many Zoom meetings. And here we are in the flesh, in person, for this four-person conversation. I'd like to point out that from the start, from the moment Rebecca Ackman from my office, who's been really working extremely hard and diligently on preparing this, from the very first moment she reached out to you, you all responded, and it was everyone was CC'd. So we sensed there was a real conversation already happening. So basically, I'll try to stay out of the way and just ask a few questions and let you continue that conversation. Maybe, I guess we can start with presentations. So to my immediate right, Natalie. Natalie is a professor, an assistant professor and practicum director for the Interdisciplinary Studies and Sexuality program here at the Simone de Beauvoir Institute. You're an interdisciplinary feminist and sexuality studies scholar working on solidarity, kinship, and attachment with social movements and activist responses to war and gender sexuality-based violence. Previously to your presence here at Concordia, and that was what, 2018 or so pre-pandemic?
2018,
yeah. So you had the chance to get your bearings and to see people in person for 2 years before everything shut down. But before that, you were at the University of Pittsburgh. Before that, you were at Thorneloe at Laurentian. And you did your PhD in social justice education at OISE and the Women and Gender Studies Institute at the University of Toronto. Just to summarize, Natalie is working on responses to the Syrian refugee crisis and sexuality pedagogies in the contemporary classroom. But we'll dig into this a bit more in a few moments. But I will present, sorry, I've got so many papers here. And I've got your list of funding, which is very impressive as well, so I won't go over all of that. Océane. Océane Jasor is a critical feminist scholar in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, where she's an assistant professor. She holds a PhD in Global and Sociocultural Studies at Florida International University, and her research centers on transnational and intersectoral approaches to the study of race and gender in an African context, and as we've seen from other articles as well, on the Caribbean context. Now, I'll just flash here, and we'll talk about that as well in a few moments. The funding has been quite impressive as well, most notably, we decided not to talk about this now, but I will mention it, the Queen Elizabeth Scholars Program grant, which is an important grant on gender equality and the decolonization of knowledge. This is a transnational collaboration between West Africa and Canada. And last but not least, Nalini Mohabir is an associate professor in geography, planning, and environment. Nalini teaches in the fields of feminist and post-colonial migration geographies, and her research is primarily in the field of Caribbean studies with a focus on indentureship. I just mentioned the book in which Océane is a chapter, but this was actually a co-edited volume that Nalini co-edited with Ronald Cummings of McMaster University, titled "The Fire That Time, Transnational Black Radicalism and the Sir George Williams Occupation." And no, I'm a professor. I'm forever a student, so I've been taking notes and post-noting it. It's absolutely fascinating. It dives us into our own complex history here at Concordia. I should mention also that there's a co-edited special issue as well. It's coming out now, or has it come out yet? On Afterlives of Indenture. It's out now, okay. You're a member of the Protest and Pedagogy Collective, co-director with Jill Ditter of the Colonial, Racial, and Indigenous Ecologies Working Group. And I could go on. Maybe I'll just mention one last thing. You won the Academic Leadership Award here at Concordia for 2020 for your contributions, including as lead organizer of the 2-week Protest and Pedagogy Conference of the winter of 2019, which obviously led to many projects, including that book. So thank you so much, all three of you, for being here and for participating in this conversation. How do you start with 3 people? Well, let's do it as simply as possible. What brought you together? How did you start collaborating, and what are you collaborating on? Who would like to start?
I'll start. Should I?
Sure.
Is it on? So how did we start collaborating with each other? First of all, we share an interest and somewhat of a focus even in our research, which is transnational feminist praxis and transnational solidarity as well. So Natalie and I were actually, we started at Concordia in the same year, and so we quickly saw parallels because we were both working on transnational solidarity, feminist solidarity in particular. So we quickly saw that we had to work together. And so we have, after the pandemic, we have started doing that. And I started collaborating with Nalini because of protest and pedagogy. And actually, my involvement with protest and pedagogy has kind of opened up a second branch of research for me. So before, as you said, my focus was on African narratives, discourses, and but I am also from the Caribbean, right? Just like Nalini, and so, but I had kind of left that region for a second, and our collaboration did that. So that has a lot to say, about the possibility of transnational collaborations. I think that it can actually open up new avenues of research, new avenues of inquiries, and a new avenue of transformative work, which is what I've been doing with Nalini over the years. And then we together, well, I'll let her say more about that, but together we have, when research kind of intersects and when research merge and it develops in a very organic way, right? We had started with protest and pedagogy with the Sir George Williams affair, and we have continued, for me it was almost a trilogy, but also we have opened up new avenues. So we have partnered, we have also had a conversation with African scholars and Caribbean scholars in collaboration together, right? So that's South-South collaborative work. So I have brought my interest and my focus on the African continent, and with her work in the Caribbean, and that has kind of become opened up a new avenue on Pan-African movements and Pan-African struggles and ideas, right? So in essence, that's what collaborative, transnational collaborations can do. I think that it can open up new avenues of research.
Right.
Do you guys think?
I think one of the things that really excited me about collaborating with Océane and Nalini has been the shared orientation that we have towards our research. So even though we're working on different geopolitical and also kind of topic areas of focus, there's so much resonance between the kinds of approaches that we take to doing the research that we're doing, the kinds of methods that we use, the ways of thinking and developing projects that I think aligned our work with one another. We're not actively working on a single research project that's doing a sociological study or a geographical study or a gender-based study specifically, but rather we're using the points of intersection across our scholarship as a way to open new avenues for the way we each think about our own research of building relationships, and I think that relationship building part is really essential. These collaborations have come out of relationships that we've built over our time here at Concordia, and I think the thing that excites me the most is the capacity of doing this kind of collaborative work as a model for building lifelong careers within institutions as well as across institutions, so that transnational focus is not only about the kinds of political work of thinking across geography, thinking across identity, thinking across differences, but also thinking about the sustainability of doing the kinds of work that we want to do right now, but also in the future through the kinds of relationships that we'll build that we hope will last over a long period of time.
Thank you. And just to build on what you've both said, I think there's something really special about the practice of both Natalie and Océane that interests me, and that's the accountability to community. So in doing that kind of grassroots, transnational, but also grassroots feminist work, there's always an understanding that practice needs to be accountable to the women that we're in conversation with. And also there's a collaborative spirit that I think needs to be foregrounded as something that transnational feminism brings to the foreground. So a different way of doing scholarship that's not about the individual, receiving accolades or awards or having a monograph or so on, but really about the process of being in dialogue with each other.
Right. And this dialogue is happening across research programs, across a research object. Can you talk a bit about how that dialogue is actually occurring, where that dialogue is occurring? Because you seem to each have your research, your individual research programs, but you're also talking across those programs. So where is this conversation happening? Is it happening in conferences? Is it happening in a dialogue, ongoing dialogue? I'm curious to know, because usually we sort of focus on collaborative research. Everyone sort of pitches in and works towards an outcome. But I'm hearing something more intangible, but also discursive and conversant here. Can you talk about that a bit?
I think that what really is kind of the cement between the three of us is a willingness to enact change, positive change, and to highlight discourses or narratives that are often, obscured, hidden even. And so that has kind of been the roots of my relationship with Nalini, but also with Natalie, in that even though we have different research, and we are not really doing joint research really, but not yet, but on, we link on the activist front. So,
Okay.
and also in community building. So
Yeah.
in Protestant pedagogy, when I worked with Nalini, it was more about, really being in touch with the community, making a difference, but also, really highlighting the need for also critical and radical scholarship. I think that even though we're not working on, let's say, a common paper, even though I have a chapter in her book, edited book, but the three of us really try to put forth radical change, I think, on the ground in the research, right, or even as a methodology in research. So for me, that's the essence of our collaboration. This critical commitment to social justice and to feminist theory.
Right. Thank you.
I think, in thinking about the connection to research, I have two kind of branches of scholarship that I work on. One is, loosely looking at solidarity and responses to war in the Middle East, where the most recent version of that project or iteration of that project is looking at refugee solidarities. And then this other branch of work that I do is on gender and sexuality pedagogies. And it seems that those two projects are kind of separate, but actually at the core of those is really an orientation towards thinking about how to enact solidarity as both a practice in global geopolitical context, like in situations of war, but also in the classroom. So the classroom as a space where solidarity is navigated and negotiated. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about us working together is that we share the development of the work that we're doing in conversation with one another, but we're also open to the possibility of what collaborations could come next. So, even though I don't work on the Caribbean, even though I'm not working on Pan-Africanism, there's a site of possibility for thinking about where is the overlap and where are possible places for connection in the future in the work that we do. And thinking very specifically about refugee solidarities, this is, we know that there will continue to be refugee crises. We know that climate change was going to produce a catastrophic wave of global refugees. We know that geopolitically that there are people in the global south will be especially affected by displacement due to climate change. And so, I think in some way, part of those conversations is to build foundations for future ways of being able to contribute with other colleagues and scholars, as well as communities of people in the practices we do across locations. And I think that that's one of the aspects of research collaboration that's interesting. I've done a lot of collaboration with other kinds of projects where we do research together, and it feels the same in the way that kind of direct research collaboration and the more conceptual collaboration function. And it's an interesting way that we don't talk explicitly about collaboration that much within, at least in my field. It's not a common conversation to have, even though a lot of people do collaborate. But there's something to it that I think is really fascinating about what becomes possible through being just in sustained contact with one another, by being in conversation with one another, and what we can build, in connection to each other's work, that I think is really interesting.
Just to come back to your question, Patrick, where you suggested maybe collaboration happens when people in institutions come together, perhaps through conferences. And I think what brings us together, and I'd like to name it, is the personal as well, that there's a personal respect, there's a personal sense of affiliation, even towards making common cause across different geographic spaces that we work in, and I think that idea of the personal, for me, is important to name because I think of it as coming through a practice of Caribbean feminism. So I think of the way that feminists in the region have built movements, have built organizations through that personal network of friendship and the politics of friendship that can lead to social change.
Let me just add to that because I think this is really important. It is actually a feminist methodology and a feminist practice to be emotive and to talk about emotions and friendship and this type of non-masculinist research. But it's important because it is through this friendship, trust, right, that you can actually talk about also your positionalities and difference. And it's important for, I think, for transnational solidarity that we don't at all costs seek inclusion and diversity and then just, being included, like assimilation and then a common goal, but that we can also trust each other through our differences, and then we can actually speak about our positionalities. And it is at the heart of transnational solidarity to really talk about that, because it highlights, the importance of power and discourses at the heart of solidarity networks, right? And we'll talk more about that when we talk about transnational feminist practice or transnational solidarity. But Nalini and Natalie made that point very clear, that trust building and friendship are also at the core.
Yeah, thank you. This is absolutely fascinating. I came at it obviously from an associate dean's perspective, and how are you leveraging this collaboration for grant making and research, and you've countered with something richer and deeper. I think it's a community of spirit, and I'm really happy that you're sharing this with us. Océane, you mentioned the notion of transnational solidarity. Could you unpack that for me? Sort of coming out of your field, what does that mean exactly, and how does this deploy itself within academia?
Okay, I'll start with the first part of the question. So in my research, I really have two key areas of inquiry: transnational feminism and then globalization and development studies. So I look at global discourses on gender and like discourses circulated, for example, by international organizations such as the UN, for example. And we are all very familiar with, this type of work. And while it has been very important and very influential in actually fostering gender development and women's empowerment everywhere in the global south and the global north, I became interested, or I am interested in looking at what is not said, the discourses that are kind of erased or put at the margin, right? So really, my research is at the intersection of global processes and then local agency or agency in the margins. And that's how I think of the transnational. I think of transnational feminist praxis as something that allows me to look at the politics of location, the hierarchies of place, right? And also at power and the relations of power. So transnational feminists, as opposed to international discourses, for example, on gender, transnational feminist praxis to me is inherently relational. It speaks about power relations, the exclusions, the omissions that are obscured in the creation of solidarity networks, right? It looks at the discourses that are erased, effaced, or made invisible, and those that are made authoritative. And I think that Jackie Alexander and Chandra Mohanty, who influenced me a lot and a lot of my work, call that the epistemological contract that we need to break. It's an epistemological contract that makes some knowledge or knowledge producers authoritative in comparison to others that are made invisible. And so in a lot of what we do or what I do, I want to look at this type of renegotiations and the messy dynamics that are just right between the global, the national, and the local, and the type of discourses that are created because out of that those messy dynamics. So the transnational, to answer the question, is messy, but I think that it's its greatest strength, and it opens up a lot of possibilities to be critical. To inform new knowledge, right? And to do also creative work in that messiness. Yes. So.
Thank you.
Okay. The thing that's interesting about doing transnational feminist and transnational feminist solidarity work in particular is that it's not, as Océane has just articulated, it's not just about the geographic relationship of like here and there or of people's relationships to different places and nationalities or identities, but actually understanding the relationship of flow across locations, and what happens in those spaces of connection across location. So, the work that I've done has been on transnational solidarity activism, and it has shifted, with the war in Syria to looking at how people have responded in ways that are constrained geopolitically by location. So what happens when, people's capacity for solidarity are constrained because of the ways in which national borders are articulated, or immigration programs introduce things, introduce ways for people to enact solidarity in particular kinds of ways. But I think what's essential in the transnational feminist approach to this is not simply looking at the global, but thinking about the interrelationship and the interconnected role of our social locations here and elsewhere, and what happens in our social locations in our positioning here. So, for example, here in Montreal, Jojage,
right.
And also elsewhere. What happens when we go to another place? What are the relationships that we build with people elsewhere? What happens when we bring colleagues or scholars or activists from elsewhere here? How do we build those relationships in ways that are ethical? How do we think about the power relationships between our social locations? And what are our ethical responsibilities to thinking about the practice of building collaboration, not only through in some way building relationships that are friendship-based, but also thinking about our role as being complicit and our role as accomplices in the structures of how people are trying to make sense of their lives and trying to organize and enact change in the lives that they're living. So that's, I think, an orientation that the three of us really take with the work that we do, I think. We're not using the language of like we are research collaborating, but I think one of the things that we're pretty certain that's going to come out of this collaborative work is going to be shared writing together. That I think we will eventually write about our process, about our methods, about our ways of thinking, and the way in which we've tried to mobilize the theoretical frameworks that guide our work and research with the actual praxis and practice of what we do in the scholarship as well as the community building ties we generate. Like I really think that relationship part of relationship building part is essential for really the survival of scholars who are racialized and who are women within institutions, to be able to build connections that can allow us to find places for support, for networks that support and sustain us, so that we can know who to contact when we need to have more access to to help to navigate something that we're confused about, whether it's an expense report or a political context of something that's happened in the world, and trying to grapple with what we do in the classroom with that or otherwise.
Thank you. I guess when I think of transnational feminist practice, I think of what I've learned from my mentor, Ndaye, the late Ndaye, whose collection of writings was recently published by Alyssa Trotz through Pluto Press. The point is to change the world. And in that book, in the introduction, Professor Trotz writes, quoting Ndiaye, how can we organize to live? And that's a conversation that I feel I've come back to time and again with Ndiaye over the years, and then I think that we'll be exploring in more depth in that context. So Ndiaye was a feminist and political activist in Guyana who was one of the founders of Red Thread, a grassroots feminist organization. And I came to her because I was also understanding transnational feminism as a way to think across the cleavages of division left over from colonial rule. So one of the things I was thinking about when I first met her was the 1964 massacre at Wismar village, of killing, rape, and the burning of property of Indo-Ghanese villagers, and how do we make sense of something that is still a difficult history to talk about, and how do we understand it to create an alternative future of that elusive idea of what independence represented. And so in thinking through transnational feminist practice with her, what she allowed me to understand was that, and again, paraphrasing from the book, that to think through what the potential of the Caribbean region offers, what revitalization might look like in the Caribbean, that it's necessary to go back to the past, whether that past is to think about slavery and indentureship, or to think about more recent concerns such as the Grenadian Revolution, but that the past and present is not as distant as we think it is, and that also Caribbean diaspora and people who live in the region are also not as distant. And so in coming together with Natalie and Océane, I think that this collaborative process, which we're at the beginning stages of, will also allow us to think about these questions of, how do we think through difficult histories, difficult contexts, difficult, vantage points that we have from our positionality towards maybe not, solidarity might be a little too hopeful in some cases, maybe not, but to think about the complexities of that.
Right. Thank you. So you've given me I think a very clear and nuanced portrait of your philosophical approach, your theoretical grounding, and some initial action items as well. How would you say transnational feminist practice looks like in Montreal specifically? Maybe at Concordia, just a few examples of things you have done, that you're working on, that you'd like to implement as well.
So the things that we have done on campus at Concordia, that I have done as part of Protestant pedagogy, because it's what we've been working on, Nalini and I. It prompts me to really reflect on the divide between, academia and an activism, and it's something that transnational scholars also have talked about. How do we bridge that gap, that it's not just research, it's also being, on the ground with people, understanding people's stories, doing with people. The act of doing is different from the act of thinking, right? And reflecting and engaging philosophically, and then you have to translate into doing something tangible. So with Protestant pedagogy, that has allowed me to do that, to build community and to build rapport across spaces. So in the Caribbean, in Canada, right, Montreal, different places in Canada, even through different times. So we talked about the 1969, then we also talk about the present and reparations. And the conversation has gone from the Caribbean to Canada to Africa, right? And that was done here on campus. Some of it was in person, and then as of late, it was online. But then through these conversations, now what we need is to translate it into tangible actions. And that's when I think we need to think about how to actually go from the conversations to, and then we need other people. We actually need allies. We need people who want to make a difference. We need people who want to change things, right? And so that also demands that we communicate and we work with people from different backgrounds, right? And with different ideas. So I think it's an ongoing process. Definitely for the work that we did as part of Protestant pedagogy, it's something that still is ongoing and that we hope will have results that people want tangible results for, right? And what is interesting is that it is across time and space, and intergenerational as well. So the change on the ground is what we really want to strive for, and that is an ongoing process.
Just to build on that, I guess, and to contextualize it. So we came together for the 50th anniversary of the 1969 occupation of what was then Sir George Williams University, of course the campus that we're on, and then afterwards the name changed to Concordia University. So Caribbean students, primarily black students, occupied the 9th floor of the Hall building to protest racism in grading practices at this university. And that event had transnational implications in that, well, it helps us to understand the site that we're on as a transnational space. Montreal is linked to the Caribbean because in addition to that protest the year before, the Congress of Black Writers happened in Montreal. For example, the Pan-Africanist scholar Walter Rodney attended that event, and the Jamaican government took the opportunity then to ban him while he was here in Canada. That decision had a ripple effect. In Jamaica, there was the so-called Rodney Riots that then occurred when students in Jamaica protested Rodney's ban. And then, the zigzagging that happens as a part of transnationalism. So if we think about the Sir George Williams occupation, students, there was the infamous Trinidad 10, the students who were, so there were 97 students arrested, 10 Trinidadian students faced very grave charges, including arson. They were about to stand trial, and Trinidadian students in Trinidad at the University of the West Indies organized protests to support them. Those protests were against Canadian interests, such as the local banks that were predominantly Canadian-owned. It was also against the Canadian Governor General. So we see the way that Montreal is, and this university in particular, is a transnational space. And what that allowed us to do in our own work was to think about then, what does the university represent, in terms of, so if we think about the university and that kind of, in the way that knowledge and disciplines are organized, perhaps along similar colonial lines, and what does thinking about it as a space that holds the potential for liberation that travels transnationally, what that might mean for the way we enter into spaces of knowledge, the way we might reorganize knowledge, the way we might use that knowledge to liberate. And so as part of that work, we organized and this is sort of outside of Concordia University because it was done without any funding, but we organized on Facebook during the pandemic a conversation among two esteemed scholars, Professor Emeritus Vereen Shepherd at the University of West Indies, and the activist Asande Ngoshang in South Africa, who was instrumental to the hashtag Rhodes Must Fall student protest, to talk about what Vereen Shepherd memorably described as, when she thought about the role of universities in protest, as, I think she said, we're building an army. And so what she meant by that is that the University of the West Indies in particular comes out of independence, comes out of the project of building the nation for a different alternative future than what the trajectory of colonialism confined us to. And when she said that, I thought of, there was an article like 20 years ago in the Ottawa Citizen, but I remember it because there was such a interesting turn of phrase it was an op-ed piece where, in response to women's studies, the columnist thought that women's studies was getting all this funding from universities, which I think we can all laugh about. He referred to women's studies scholars as building the formidable feminist war machine. And so and I think that when I think of what Vereen Shepherd was saying in that we're building an army, what does it look like to build this kind of transnational feminist practice across borders towards this project of liberation that we're scaling up through these dialogues across, across the global South, and also hopefully opening up to an audience here as well in the diaspora and beyond.
What Nalini said about the role of the university is really important. We also collaborating on something that will bring West African scholars, right, from Ghana and from Senegal, and just thinking. We're going to talk about gender narratives that come from the continent, come from an African perspective, but really Pan-African perspective as well. But then, and so the role of the university is really to enhance and to give a voice, I think, to critical discourses and transnational, this type of transnational solidarity networks, right? But then we don't necessarily think of the university as a tool for change, right? And so what does it mean, I think, to think about the university as that, something, as a tool for change, as an actor, a necessary actor in change, and that can be messy, as I said, but it's exciting to think about what it could look like if the university, even the neoliberal university, can actually take its position and do more, I suppose, toward radical change. So that's the type of openings that the transnational allows, I think, because when you bring, especially voices and experiences, lived experiences from the South, and then you have this type of South-South, global South collaborations and new agenda kind of emerge, and similar, not just research, but similar lived experiences, similar grievances, similar struggles, and you have this opportunity to be at the center of this global South conversation. I think it's one needs to take that seriously, and to engage with that in a non-exploitative way. And I think that's the challenge of the university, not just this one, but academia in the future, is to take its position in this type of critical struggles.
Just briefly, I'm being told.
Wrap up. I think that one of the things that both Nalini and Océane have articulated is just the fact that transnational feminist solidarity and praxis isn't only just about going global, but it's also the orientation to the work that we do together. So not necessarily, not assuming that geographic divides are the basis for separating out the kind of conversations that should happen, thinking about what can be generative out of speaking through and about research that is situated differently, not only in geopolitical terms, but also in terms of the kinds of political interventions that people engage in and the way in which we mobilize that within our own areas of scholarship and teaching. And also through mentorship and what can happen in relation to how we work with our graduate students, with collaboration and building relationships in the future, and the hope that through the work together that in the next couple years we'll be able to build longer term sustainable relationships with scholars from Ghana and Senegal as a basis for new areas of possible collaboration. And I'm thinking here about, for example, my work on gender and sexuality pedagogies. In a kind of global feminist framework, we might say that, feminists from the global north bring gender equity and development issues to the global south through international aid funding and research programs that then introduce the critical scholarship that's done in global north institutions to the global south to mobilize that to help improve the conditions of women in the global south. So that's a kind of traditional framework that we might use. A transnational feminist framework asks a different set of questions. How has the legacy of colonization impacted the way in which gender and sexuality are articulated and experienced within geopolitical contexts across the world? What are indigenous forms and orientations towards arranging ourselves, and where are points of intersection and points of friction or divide? And instead of shying away from those sites of possible conflict around how we interpret or understand gender and sexuality, to really try and grapple with that and grapple with what shapes those differences and why they might be important in one context versus another. And so I think that orients the work that we do together, it orients the work that we do separately, and it orients, I think, the work that we want to do in the future in, I think, pretty concrete terms, actually, even though we've been speaking very, very abstractly in some ways. It really it grounds the practice of doing the scholarly networking, the scholarly research, the scholarly writing, the discussions and the dissemination.
Thank you so much. This has been an amazing learning experience. I was to conclude with a question which I'll ask, but you've answered it. What transformations can solidarity initiatives by BIPOC women bring? Well, you have clearly demonstrated a number of them. Thank you for presenting a very sustainable, cohesive, and activist model that can exist in the university. We're all out of time, and I sincerely regret this. I feel like we've only just started, but let's say this is the first of many conversations. Thank you.
Maybe I'll just say for the folks on Zoom that we will be closing up now. Thank you for being here on Zoom or watching the live stream on YouTube. Check it out, Concordia University's Fourth Space YouTube page. You'll see all of the recorded conversations from this week. And thank you very much to Patrick for spending the day with us here today, and to all of his guests. Bye, everyone.